Hi everyone, thanks for coming along, whether you're in St Andrews or somewhere else. It's really nice to be back in Scotland, especially in St Andrews, and I've given a number of seminars in this room, so it's really nice to be back having gone away. So the title of my talk, looking at, let's go back, there we go. The title of my talk, looking at telemetry data from above and below, is meant to tell you a bit about what I was doing before I moved away and went to Cape Town and what I've been doing since. So I did my master's, well, my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD here in St Andrews. And for the most of it, I was looking at diving behavior in seals. I focused quite a lot on how the tags themselves collect data, and I'm going to present a little bit of work that I did on that. And I really focused on diving, so air-breathing mammals. The project that I went to work on in Cape Town as a postdoc at the Center for Statistics and Ecology, Environment and Conservation, which is quite a new unit that's been set up, was on black eagles. So really different. Soaring birds, there was high-resolution GPS data, and also 3-axis acceleration data. I wanted to talk a little bit about all of the projects that I'm working on at the moment, and I'm quite excited about. So the talk is going to jump around a little bit, and only a couple of the projects are finished, so most of this is in progress. So if anyone has any suggestions or ideas or comments, please let me know, because I can work it in. Oh, I should say, thanks very much to MASTS for hosting me, and also Len Thomas and Roland Langrock at Cream, and Jason Mathiopoulos in Glasgow. I haven't done that piece of my visit yet. That's happening in August. Okay, so my research focuses on movement behavior. This could be diving, soaring, cruising, walking, or perching. Well, what does movement behavior really tell us about animals? Well, it's a measurable expression of the environmental space that animals choose if they can get there, so that's the accessibility bit that we need to think about. And where they go might tell us something about the resources they're likely to be exploiting. The reason movement is a really important aspect of animal ecology is because it helps us to mitigate conflicting use of resources between the animals themselves and people, manage any potentially harmful interactions with human activities. It helps us to do effective spatial planning and also monitor for wildlife diseases. So knowing where animals go is important for all sorts of reasons. So the examples that I've used to look at where animals go and what they do there, which are the most interesting questions for me, from seals, and this has mainly been quite sparse data, and that's a combination of the instruments that we use to record the behavior, but also the behavior of the animals themselves. And I'm going to talk about 3 projects under the seals heading, mainly how the tags themselves abstract the dives, because we're not able to send all of the information back about the diving behavior. I'm going to talk a little bit about spatial variation in grey seal dive depth, and I'm going to present a state space model of within dive behavior. And those are things that I did during my PhD and I've been working on since and developing into publications. The second data set I'm going to draw examples from is black eagles from South Africa, as I mentioned, and this is a really rich data set. The GPS locations can be collected up to every 3 seconds, and for quite a lot of the GPS locations, there's also 3-axis acceleration collected at 20 Hertz. So you end up with 3 vectors of 20 for each of the GPS locations for which we have acceleration data. And I've done a little bit of work looking at how we can model activity patterns using the acceleration data, using state space models again, this time hidden Markov models. And I'm also drawing on machine learning methods to classify behavior, because the state space models really rely on regular intervals in the data, and as whoever works on animal tracking data knows, that's often not the case. So classification methods get around this by not assuming anything about regularity in sampling. An important thing to think about in tracking data is that you get locations, you get positions and information about where animals are going and what they're choosing. You don't get information about where they're not going and what they're not choosing if they can get there. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind when dealing with tracking data. So my 2 primary interests, and the ones I'm presenting here, well, I have others, but these are the ones I'm going to present here, knowing quite how the tags collect data, because I think that's really important, and a lot of users of tag data sort of gloss over that aspect, partly because it's complicated, but also because you're so excited about the data, you want to know about it, and you often forget quite what the caveats are and also the opportunities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and that's the first bit that I'm going to talk about now. And then the second thing that I'm going to talk about is getting the information out of the data we collect. That's going to be the methodological part of my talk. So when I was a fresh PhD student here at SMRU, I got a whole lot of data from diving in elephant seals. And really the first thing I wanted to know was about the tags. How do these tags collect data, and what does it mean for what we can actually do with the data? And it ended up being quite a fortuitous interest because it fed into a lot of the other work that I did. So especially when you're dealing with animals where you can't get the tag back, for example, wide-ranging seals, you really need to think quite carefully about how long you want the tag to last and how often you want data and what you want that data to be. So there's quite an important trade-off happening here. So on the one hand, if you're transmitting really often, you're wasting energy sending profiles too often. On the other hand, if you are sampling really high, you're collecting data that can't be sent. So there's a sweet spot in the middle, and the reviewers didn't like this to be humped, so it had to be flat because this, I guess, yeah, this does vary from system to system. But there's an area in the middle where you're basically trading off between how much information you can send back and how often you can send it, given the battery life of your device, the transmission technology, and also the animal behavior. Just a review about the specific case of these CTD-SRDLs has just been accepted in animal biotelemetry by myself and a whole lot of other people here. So the point really is that the type of data you collect affects the questions you can ask, and the questions you want to ask should really be driving the type of data you collect. So the information that the CTD-SRDLs collect are abstracted data from elephant seal dives. Typically, you get 4 points at depth and 2 points at the surface. And that is a linear approximation of the wiggly path that the tags actually collect and the animals carry out. It's important to remember that this is a flat representation of something that is not flat. So you're only seeing the depth and time component. These data are collected from elephant seals. For people who don't know what they look like, elephant seals range really widely. So if you want a tag to collect data over months, you are constrained to only collect small amounts of data that you can actually send back. So the way you arrive at this abstracted profile is by something called the broken stick model, which is a linear approximation method. And the way it works is like this. So you collect a high-resolution time-depth profile of a seal dive, and the first thing that happens on board the tag is that a straight line is drawn between the two surface points, which are known because the tag has a surface detector. Then the distances between that line and the depths in the dive are all measured, and the deepest point is selected and added to the profile. So at the first iteration, the dive is represented by a V shape. This process carries on iteratively until you've added as many points as you want to your dive profile. On board CTD-SRDLs, this is 4 points at depth. The true time depth profile is then discarded, and what's sent back is this abstracted profile. So what I wanted to know was how well or how badly does this abstracted profile represent the true time depth profile. And it ends up, because we know exactly how that abstraction is carried out on board the tags, you can reverse it. And by reversing it, you don't end up back at the detailed dive profile, but you can obtain limits to where you know the depths in the dive would have occurred. And this is what's represented with these yellow lines in what I ended up calling the dive zone. So I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to know, well, okay, now that we've got a measure, now we've got limits to where the dive might have occurred, or sorry, where the dive did occur with 100% certainty, I wanted to know how we could compare dive zones between dives so that you can attach a measure of uncertainty to these abstracted profiles. So to do that, I came up with something that I called the dive zone index, But basically, you go along the dive at each of the time points, you measure the distance between the upper limit and the lower limit of this zone. You add them all up and you divide by the maximum depth and the time, the duration of the dive, because longer dives are going to have bigger zones, so that needs to be scaled for that. So this index ranges from 0 to 1, and it's a relative measure of dive path uncertainty, which allows comparison between dives. The reason I wanted to do this is because a lot of people take this information and try and infer what the animal's actually doing at different places and based on these dive profiles. So now, using this relative index, you can get an idea of how much you should trust the different abstracted dive profiles that you're obtaining. And this is just, I think, yeah, about 10 consecutive dives with the dive zone index printed there. So my hope is that this measure can now be fed into regression analysis or any other kind of analyses people are doing as a measure of uncertainty. So that was the more sort of technological interests that I pursued during my PhD. And the next bit is stuff that I've been doing since, but also stemming from work that I did during my PhD. Just as a preface, there are lots of ways of modeling animal movement. I'm going to present examples from 3 of these, I guess, avenues. Let's see. I'm hesitating here because there are so many ways you could carve this field up, and this is just one of them. And I did it this way so that I could sort of fit my examples in nicely. So an example of phenomenological models is logistic regression. And in this case, what you're looking for is relationships between things that you can observe. An extra step, when you go into the more mechanistic models, like state space models, you can actually propose ideas about the mechanisms that drive the things that you can observe. And lastly, I'm not sure if this should really be on the same slide as these, but I've got an example of that too. So machine learning can come in handy in some cases when you can't use other kinds of models. So I'm going to give an example of that as well, where it actually has been quite useful. So starting with a regression type model, this is about grey seals just here in the North Sea. These animals were tagged in 2008 on Abate Sands. There's 7 individuals. And grey seals are thought to dive to the bottom and feed on benthic prey. But they've never actually been shown. And so I'd walk around the top floor of SMRU and say, oh, the first chapter of my thesis is looking at dive depth in grey seals. And someone said, well, yeah, everyone knows they dive to the bottom. But I couldn't find any references that actually showed that. So it's quite an interesting exercise. And what I wanted to do was get a predictive map of how deep seals are expected to dive in different places. So my predictions were based in this little box. So I fitted a GAM, and I had maximum dive depth, so the maximum depth in each of the dives, as a response variable. I had a number of things as explanatory variables or smooth functions to accommodate nonlinearity. So I had bathymetry, the horizontal displacement of the animal, the day of the year, the percentage of gravel in the sediment, whether it was light or dark, and also individual effect as a random effect. And the maps I came up with are, the first column shows daytime maps, nighttime maps, and then the first row shows the predicted depth in real terms. So obviously they're restricted by bathymetry, so there's quite a lot of shallow areas here. And as you go further away, you end up diving deeper and deeper. And on the whole, they dive shallower at night, or so my model predicted, but not in all areas. I also wanted to know what proportion of the water column they were using. So I divided my predicted depth by the available depth, so the bathymetry at the areas. And this proved quite interesting because it showed that seals don't vary their dive depth diurnally like in other areas on the Dogger Bank. So given that they are thought to feed on sand eels here quite a lot of the time, it's quite interesting as to how they're apportioning their effort there. Perhaps because it's it's a lot shallower than the other areas, and they don't need to do shallow diving, which is perhaps resting. Amazingly, this model explains 67% of the variability in the data. So it's a good example of how something quite a simple approach can actually explain some of what's going on. So I just want to present a little preface to state space models in case anyone hasn't come across them before. State space models are really handy for modeling time series. They are mechanistic because you can specify a process model. And they're doubly stochastic, which means you model the state process and the observation process separately, and you model the errors separately as well. And this is really handy for telemetry data because you've got some observations that you're obtaining with error, for example, from telemetry devices, and you've also got a state process that you're uncertain about. I'm going to present a bit of work using state space models and hidden Markov models, and they're really closely related. They both deal with changes in discrete time steps. What you tend to see in the literature is that people call state space models things that have continuous state variables like depth or step length, and models that have discrete state variables like behaviors tend to be called hidden Markov models. And yet you can account for the measurement error and the uncertainty in how the movement behavior arises with these two different parts to the model. Yep. So this is also part of work that I did for my PhD. We wanted to see if we could estimate behaviors within a dive. So we wanted to see if we could sort of pick apart the descent state, the bottom state, and the ascent state using a model. Quite often you can just look at a dive and tell where the descent ends and where the ascent begins, but it's much more elegant to do this with a model and actually learn about the changes that are occurring. So in this case, the hidden states that we were trying to estimate were depth as the first pass, but then also the behavioral types. And the observations were a special case in this case because the observations that we had, we didn't want to use just the abstracted profile because we had more information than that. We had the limits in which the true dive would have occurred. So this ended up being the observation model, and what we were trying to reconstruct was the dive path and then also get the behaviors. So we ended up having an observation model with a uniform distribution between the upper and the lower levels because we knew that all depths in the dive were within the yellow zone. For the movement process, we used a random walk model, and the reason that I wanted to implement this in a Bayesian context was that we knew about the behavior of elephant seals. We weren't coming at it naively. There was a lot of dive data that we could use to inform the model. And even though it was quite an arduous process to get the model to fit, conceptually it was neat to be able to do it. From a practical consideration point of view, frequentist models are much more useful because they run a lot faster. But in this case, it was nice to be able to include prior information about how the animals were actually moving. So the random walk in this case was centered on depth at time t with some precision, and that just moved forward based on time at the previous depth of the previous time step and some variability. We also used the fact that they must return to the surface. So we had time in the model as a covariate to bring the animal back to the surface. So basically what was happening is you're having depths projected through this zone and back up to the surface with a tendency to return to reduced depth as time through the dive went on. So the dive reconstruction bit didn't go as well as we'd hoped. So the black bit, so let's start here on the left-hand side, you've got the broken stick model profile in green, the true dive path in black, and the gray being the zone. And on the right, this is the reconstructed path, and the gray bits are the posterior credible intervals going from 50% in the dark gray up to 100%, perhaps 95. And it didn't do a very good job of picking up all of the little wiggles in the dive, but perhaps that's not what we really wanted to do. Perhaps what was more important is that we managed to recreate the distribution at depth rather than all of the tiny details and wiggles in the path. So this represents two chains, so the blue and the red are the two separate Markov chains. And drift in state 1, which is a descent rate, telling you that the tendency is to move downwards. Tendency is for this dive was more or less to also decrease in depth. And then in the third state, which was the ascent state, it was to go back to the surface. So these were the behavioral states that the model ended up estimating, black being the descent, red being the bottom state, and green being the ascent rate. So this is just one example of, well, one dive. But overall, the model ended up performing quite well, even though it was very slow to run, unfortunately. So that's something that I'm going to be working on with Jason next month. Okay, so moving away from seals and into the world of soaring raptors. I'm not sure how many people know much about raptors. I knew very little when I first started working on them. So black eagles are really large birds. They weigh about 3 kilos. They live in pairs, and they build these really big nest structures on cliffs. They lay a couple of eggs. Generally, only one of the chicks survives, and they're thought to feed mainly on rock hyrax. You get black eagles in sub-Saharan Africa, everywhere where you'll get rock hyrax and steep relief in the cliff faces. So those are the two things they need: nesting habitat and resources. So a collaborator of mine in Cape Town, Megan Murgatroyd, has spent 3 years of her life in this area here, which is in the southwest corner of South Africa. And this area is called the Cedarburg. She managed to, as part of her PhD, she did all sorts of things looking at population biology and breeding success and diet of black eagles, but she also put out 5 tags. So this is the Cedarburg area, and just to the left towards the sea, this area is called the Sandveld. On the right, we've got a really quite pristine mountain habitat where you'd expect to find black eagles, and then on the left in this area, it's a very highly agriculturally converted area where most of the potatoes in South Africa are grown. Before I move on to that, I just want to show you, this is Megan holding onto one of the black eagles, and they tagged them. These tags are made at the University of Amsterdam by the bird tracking system group. They're solar powered, and they're really small. Given this bird weighs 3 kilos, they're well under 3% of their body weight. And they've got little solar panels, which works really well somewhere like South Africa where there's lots of sunshine. Probably wondering why this red bird's scattered all over the place. It actually got ousted by another bird. There's quite a lot of competition for mates and also for nesting habitat. So, and they're very territorial. They don't really overlap. They need about sort of a 5-kilometer radius around their nest, which they keep as their own. So this bird actually got ousted during the tagging period and went and set up somewhere else and ranged really widely. So this is what the Sandveld looks like. These are potato circles. So there's very little rocky, there are very few rocky outcrops for the birds to nest in. This is an area where actually all 3 birds were nesting. There's quite sparse nesting habitat in this area, but there's diverse prey because there are a lot of animals that are living in the fields, and there's quite low nest density. And then this is what the Cedarburg looks like. Very few roads, very few people, lots of mountains and rock hyrax, and not much else. So there's abundant nesting habitat, even though it's pretty much at carrying capacity. There's high nest density, and there's pretty much one main prey type. So one of the questions we were interested in is, well, how do behavior and activity patterns differ in these 2 different areas? Are the birds that live in this area doing badly compared to the more pristine habitat, or is it in fact the other way around? And so it's still work in progress, so I don't have any big answers, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the difficulties I ran into while I was trying to figure out a way to analyze these data. So in dealing with movement from soaring birds, you've got a problem of, well, there aren't a lot of things that will indicate movement. For example, there's very infrequent flapping because they mainly just put out their wings and use thermals to soar and gain altitude and also glide down. And they also use the ridge lines to soar. So the data included GPS locations, and not all of the GPS locations included acceleration data, but some of them did. And when you did get acceleration, so it was 20 samples over 1 second in each of the 3 axes. So I spent quite a lot of time deciding how to summarize and interpret the acceleration data. And I explored just summing the 3 vectors using minimum specific acceleration and also the jerk index. What I ended up using was the minimum specific acceleration. And the reason I liked that, and yes, I didn't mention the irregular sampling. The reason I chose the minimum specific acceleration was mainly because it was really intuitive for me to understand. But before I explain that, I just wanted to show you what some of the samples look like. So when the bird is flapping, it's really clear to see it in the acceleration signature. You get a really big signal in the z-axis. When the bird's soaring, you get just little undulations in the signature, and then when the bird is perched or moving very little, you get really flat lines. Okay, so acceleration can be, for animals moving in the air and on the ground, it can be split up into gravity-related acceleration and specific acceleration. So basically, if you take away the gravitational component from your acceleration, you end up with whatever would have been attributable to movement. So when the bird's stationary, if you take the square of each of the 3 vectors, add them up, and take the square root, you'll end up with 1g, which is a gravitational force. So if you take the absolute value of your acceleration, if you take this value and take 1 away from it, you end up with what can be attributed to movement. So it doesn't give you the specific acceleration itself, but it gives you a lower bound for the acceleration that is not attributable to gravity. And I wanted to use this as a crude way of separating activity from little activity in these birds. So if you look at the trace of the minimum specific acceleration for each of these samples, and for my purpose, I wasn't interested in what was going on within that 1 second interval. I just took the maximum. So I figured a high MSA meant activity and a lower MSA meant less activity. So I fitted a hidden Markov model, and that's what I've been working on here at Cream with Roland Langrock for the last few weeks. I called these states very loosely sit and fly. They don't correspond to those behaviors exactly, but it's meant to mean less activity, more activity. So MSA is bounded by 0, and it's continuous, so I used a gamma distribution to model it. But it ended up that the sitting state, the less active state, had 2 distributions sort of within it. So in order to accommodate this, we used a mixture of 2 gammas. So we estimated a mean and a variance for each of those distributions, and also the weighting parameter. And so the mean and the variance in a gamma distribution translates to the shape and the scale like this. As part of the model fitting, we also estimate the transition matrix, and we expected, based on the behavior of the birds, to have a high probability of flying at the next time step if you were flying at this time step, and also sitting at this time step if you were sitting at the previous time step. So residency, we expected residency in those 2 different behaviors. So this ended up working really nicely, and we ended up with an active state that had a mean of MSA of 0.32, and then the other 2 states with quite low means. And we ended up with those high values in the diagonal as we expected. So this is the histogram is the raw data, and the lines are the estimated density from the model. So you end up with a peak at the low end of MSA for the sitting state, and a flatter curve for the flying state. And this is just for one bird. And if you look at the estimated states for that bird, and this represents 9 days of data, so there's no acceleration data at night, which is why these gaps are here, and then you get a whole bunch of data for each of the days, and these are the posterior estimates. So I still need to check all of this. I need to do it for all the other birds. So there's still quite a lot of work to do, but it's great to have a working model at this stage. There's opportunities for improvement. Whether 2 states is realistic or unrealistic is still up for debate. I don't have any in situ ground truthing at the moment, so no one sat and watched the birds after they were tagged to see what the data looked like and what behaviors corresponded to those data. I'd also like to include covariates to inform transition probabilities, for example, time of day, because the birds need thermals to soar, so they're more active in the day and less active at night, which is why there are no data at night. I also need to investigate individual variability and minimum specific acceleration. But given that I only have 5 birds, I'm not sure quite how to get around that. I need to somehow accommodate it, but fitting a random effect to 5 birds, I'm not sure it's going to be very defensible. So I need to think about that a bit more. So what I didn't mention about the previous model is that I picked out all of the samples that were recorded at a certain time interval. So there was a constant time interval between all of those samples. But in doing that, I ended up throwing away quite a lot of data. So, which is less than ideal, because it's great to be able to use all of the information that you have. So what I did instead of that, and this is part of a collaboration with Megan Murgatroyd at UCT, I used random forest, which is a machine learning method. And it's less powerful in some ways and doesn't acknowledge or account for any of the autocorrelation in the data, but it is quite useful for uneven sampling intervals. It makes no assumptions about that. So I wanted to see if I could get more than 2 behaviors out of the GPS locations. So I used the high resolution GPS locations at recorded at either 3 or 4 seconds between locations to look at more fine scale behaviors. I trained about 10% of the GPS locations from each bird, which ended up being about 20,000 GPS locations. I didn't just want to look at each of the locations on their own, because obviously it's meaningless without the context of a track. So I looked at a window 90 seconds either side of each of the GPS points I was going to train. I just want to give you examples of the 4 behaviors I was confident I was able to identify. So the red spot is where the bird started. Its track within this 90-second window. The green spot is where it ended, and the blue spot is the GPS point that you're training. So this is a really clear example of thermaling in black eagles. You get this really clear spiral pattern in the GPS locations, and you get an increase in altitude above ground level. You also get this really regular change in compass bearing because the bird's spiraling. Another behavior that they do also to gain height is orographic soaring. So in this case, you can see the bird's flying in a really straight line, but it's also gaining height. But it's not really gaining height above ground level, it's varying. So this is an indication the bird's flying along a ridge line and gaining height that way. A third behavior is perching. So here the blue spot's on top of the red spot, and there's a really stable trace in altitude above sea level and above ground level. The last behavior is gliding, where the bird is just has gained height through orographic soaring or thermaling, and it's losing height. So again, a really straight trajectory and gradual decrease in altitude. So I was really confident that I could tell those apart. So I went through and I classified the 10% of the GPS locations and fitted the random forest model and ended up with a 9% error. So I was quite pleased with that. And I'm not sure the colors are showing up so well, but this is a track of a bird, and it's colored based on the predicted behaviors along the track. So I'm just going to point out thermaling in purple, and you can see these possibly not visible to the untrained eye, but I spent a lot of time looking at these GPS tracks. So you can see this where the bird's doing those really tight spirals. The model's picked up that it's thermaling along these straight trajectories. It's picked up gliding and segments of orographic soaring. It makes some mistakes, but that's to be expected. But my hope is that this information can feed into something like a regression model to actually see where these behaviors are occurring in the two different landscapes and how much time the birds are spending engaged in these different behaviors. So it's not as elegant as fitting a mechanistic model, but it's getting around some of the problems that those models present for telemetry data. A lot of people helped with making the Black Eagle project happen, so I'd just like to acknowledge them. I'm funded by the NRF, and I'd like to thank everyone back in Cape Town and people here that I continue to work with, and people here at the University of St Andrews. Jason, I'm going to work for. These are my hosts, and people who actually made my visit possible. And just like to, thank you for coming and open the floor for questions.
So both these tags that you were using are throwing away data, and that is causing you trouble, right? And when the people designed these tags, they would of course think about your research projects or necessarily the sort of thing that you would like to do with the data when they design that compression algorithm. The MSA, for example, is a really interesting example of how they could have sent perhaps much less data, just the MSA, and that would be for you essentially a sufficient statistic. So you must have learned things from what you've been doing as to how to better design a compression algorithm within the tag. Perhaps you could talk about that and how we could perhaps affect such a feedback with the tag makers and data users.
Yeah, thank you. So for those of you not here, the question was, how can we, as the people who are receiving the data and analyzing the data, how can we better inform tag designers and software engineers to send us back sufficient statistics, or in fact only parts of the data that we really need, and how can we make that happen going forward? It's a really important question, and I think it's one that is being discussed a lot in terms of all sorts of different kinds of tags. And I think as far as acceleration is concerned, the answer is that I think particularly in the bird world, people aren't used to dealing with acceleration data. So they're not 100% sure what they want or need. So I think I'm one of the first people to use these the acceleration data from the University of Amsterdam bird tracking system tags, because, as you say, there's huge volumes of it being collected, and everyone's doing something different. The real difference here in terms of the eagle tracking data is that you get little snippets of acceleration data every so often, and it can be every 3 seconds, it can be every 10 seconds, it can be once an hour, depending on the condition of the tag, how much energy it's got, how sunny it was that day, how full it is. So I think what information you want back is going to depend on a number of things, and I think perhaps that's why there hasn't been a consensus in terms of what exactly to send back. But it's a really important conversation to have, and I'm not sure how to get all of the relevant people together in order to have that conversation, given the users will have quite diverse interests. Toby?
Could you go back to your slide of the stuff given Markov?
The next one?
So these, you said you chose data that were regular.
Yes.
And the constant, you've got this issue with slightly continuous data. You do have the other stuff, right? The altimetry data and all those things. So it seems like you could, if you've got states like sit and fly, if your altitude above ground is 0, obviously simplistically, right? So you could probably constrain or use the other data to inform that model when you have gaps to some extent. But then, what I can't remember from our previous conversation was how big the gaps are, or whether there's sort of a really bad mismatch in scale.
Okay, so the question was, can you use the GPS locations and ancillary information to inform this model that's only using the acceleration data? And the answer is that yes, except you'd be cutting down your sample size further because you also have to consider the overlap between the acceleration and the GPS locations. So there'll be some of, let me see if I'm getting this right. Okay, no, because, sorry, I'm thinking about the other way around. So given that this is acceleration data, there will be GPS locations for every single one of these points. So, yeah.
Sort of use acceleration data as maybe your first data if you have it. If you don't, you resort to that.
The catch there is that because the birds perch on a cliff face, the GPS error actually goes up quite substantially when the bird is perched because it's in the shadow of a cliff. So that information itself could be used, but it's slightly more complicated than zero altitude because it's not going to be at zero altitude, even above the ground. It'll be at, say, 40, but it will be constant. And if you're lucky and you've got a good signal.
It shouldn't flip into flying, or it shouldn't be in sit state if your altitude above ground is very high.
No, although I'm not sure like how, what is the mean altitude of an eagle's nest. I'm not sure I'd be able to say with confidence, if you see what I mean.
I guess it depends on what you control the data.
Yeah, but it's definitely a good idea that I could use some of the extra data to inform it in some way or another. Okay, if there are no more questions from here, I think we can hand over to people who are not here. Doesn't seem to be there any questions. Okay.
I was just going to say, if anyone in the online audience does have any questions, if you could type them out now or raise a virtual hand, it would be appreciated.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
All right, well, thanks very much.